Welcome to 20th Century Geek. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 20th Century Geek and Happy New Year! Welcome to 2019 and the new format, or the newish format, for 20th Century Geek. So hopefully you've caught the last episode and we talked about all the different topics and the way we're going to be doing things in the new year. Just trying something new. And we're going to be starting the new year with a thought piece. So this was just a question I put out and I thought about for a little bit, and I brought in a friend of mine to have a chat about. So Julian Darius is going to be joining me today to talk about Tim Burton and modern fairy tales. Or at least that's where we started. That was the starting point. And the conversation goes all over the place. Talk about auteur, directors, modern cinema, and the impact directors have on the end product as well. So sit back, relax, and join us on one of our fascinating, and I mean fascinating, conversations. Okay, I'm going to hand over to me and Julian. So Julian, welcome back to the show. I appreciate you coming back on. First one of the 2019, and also first one of the new sort of format. And this is our first thought piece. And the thought piece is Tim Burton and modern fairy tales. And the reason I came to this was over Halloween and over sort of early Christmas as well. I watched an awful lot of sort of Tim Burton crops up. So I watched like The Corpse Bride, I watched Nightmare Before Christmas, but I also watched like Beetlejuice, Edward Scissorhands, and Sleepy Hollow. And I just felt that more than other directors of his era and his generation, although he's still active, he depicts close to that grim fairy tale aesthetic. And I wanted to explore that more, really. And does he bring that into a modern society with things like Edward Scissorhands and a few others? So that was the idea behind this. So the first question to you, really, Julian, is what are your feelings on Tim Burton and your exposure to him, really?
Well, I'm of a certain generation. So for me, the sort of late 80s and early 90s were, by and large, with few exceptions, a kind of cultural wasteland of hair bands and Kiss and all of this. And, you know, it was Reagan Bush. And if you were an artsy, weird guy, you really had very, very little. And so Burton was incredibly meaningful to me, especially as a young adult. And I think he was for a lot of people. I think that, you know, the fact that he was weird, the fact that he was, you know, his movies were filled with weird characters and were allowed to be eccentric, and the sense of humor was dark. And, you know, he meant a lot and made a lot of people feel less alone, including myself. What was your experience?
No, it's funny, because I was sort of in '89. Well, in fact, Batman Returns is probably my first true exposure to Tim Burton. And I remember because I was slightly too young for the first Batman film. Although I recognised his existence, I was probably 8 at the time. 8 or 9, and it wasn't until, like I say, Batman Returns in '91 that I really saw that, and I was like, that looks cool. Like, you know, the Batmobile looks cool, the city looks cool, the costumes look cool, and Danny DeVito especially as the Penguin, like, really stood out. And I think it was then that I started to pay more attention, but it wasn't really until probably a little bit later in the '90s that when I started to understand film a little bit better in my early teens, that I started to understand that the person who made Batman and Batman Returns also made Edward Scissorhands and Beetlejuice. And at that point, you sort of see that there's, it makes sense. And I just remember, as you say, the aesthetic and the design element just stood out, because everything else of that era, especially the early to mid 90s, was, not to say it was bland, but it was either extreme in the comics or it was it was restricted by budgetary things. So superhero films were not great, and horror was on the slide, and so the early 90s really was not a good era for cinema. It was about indie cinema. So anything else that was sort of glossy, I suppose Tim Burton was that. He just stood head and shoulders over all these other directors for me.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that a lot. I think that's very true of the 90s, and I think that I'm remembering sort of like the late Schwarzenegger films. Those were kind of still big at the box office, and in a way, I think of Burton in that period was kind of like the Chris Nolan of the time, in the sense that he was way more artistic than other mainstream cinema. And Burton could open a movie. I mean, obviously, Batman was one of the biggest movies of all time. Batman Returns did really well, and some of his movies had a cult following, but he could open a movie, and he could, turn something like Beetlejuice or Batman, I mean, at a time when superheroes were box office poison, into a mega franchise that just has nothing to rival it. And I think that he was really rare in mainstream directors. I was 11 when Batman opened, and I must have seen that movie. Like that was the first movie that I read the comic adaptation before the movie.
Yeah.
And it came out like a week before, and I had like Batman cereal. I had all the toys, those horrible Toy Biz toys that broke. I just kept buying replacements, and I must have seen that movie maybe 50 times in theaters. I would just go like every other day, and my parents were probably just glad that I wasn't bothering them. I probably saw Nightmare Before Christmas 20 times in theaters. I mean, by the time it was out of theaters, I knew every line in Batman. I had seen it so many times. So, I mean, I definitely was sort of like, I was an 11-year-old kid who completely got the Batman craze.
Yeah.
And I had grown up on Dark Knight Returns and stuff like that. And so the idea that they were taking comics and doing it right, that's another thing that I often think of about the Nolan films, that they get so much credit for kind of doing it right. And I think in retrospect, we see Burton's Batman as, like you said, a more sort of fairy tale kind of, gothic noir thing that's kind of quirky and unrealistic, and Batman Returns goes more in that direction. But at the time, really, Dark Knight Returns is kind of quirky and not as realistic as some people think in retrospect. And so Batman and its success meant so much to me as a comics reader.
I think you're right. I think it's funny. It's one of these things of like, it's almost like the ex-girlfriend or the ex sort of partner of you move on, you get something new and exciting, and we've now had let's say the Nolan trilogy, and then Batfleck with Ben Affleck. That people go, well, Batman '89 and Batman Returns are a bit campy and a bit silly, and Batman, he sort of kills people, and it's like, and you sort of think, but you don't rip Adam West, and that was ridiculous. It's a different type. It's and I do feel that sort of like you've got Batman '66 and the Nolan verse being either ends of the spectrum, and then in the middle you've got this sort of like dark nugget of, it is almost like a fairy tale land. Like Gotham in the Burton universe is this sort of dark, sort of German expressionistic, sort of Art Deco nightmare of a city that you know, architecturally it just doesn't, it shouldn't work, but it just stands out, and it's influenced so much that to rip on it now, if you were to look, I mean, the whole aesthetic of the Batman the animated series and the music, like the look, it was all predicated on the designs that were created for the Batman and Batman Returns. And that Batmobile design, that the Batmobile design that created for the '89 Batman has influenced so much since, and I think sometimes people lose sight of that.
I think that's all true, and I think that people forget that when Batman came out, the problem was that '66 was still strong in the public's mind, and it was not expected to work. He cast Michael Keaton as Batman. I mean, he cast Mr. Mom as Batman. That was, Michael Keaton was known as a comedic actor, and even in Beetlejuice, it's largely a comedic role. And I think Michael Keaton does a phenomenal job. But I think that, at the time, Batman '66 was so strong in people's minds, and the idea that you could even do a serious superhero, in the same way that, like, he had been fired from Disney for, making dark short films.
Yeah.
Batman was considered too dark. In fact, that wound up being apparently one of the reasons why they went with Schumacher.
Yeah, well, I think it's Kevin Smith has joked about it on numerous occasions, but Warner Brothers had a deal with McDonald's to do Happy Meals, and they'd sort of left sort of Burton to his own devices, and then when they sort of saw what he created, I think they were a bit like, yeah, we can't really sell toys of this sort of, demented penguin and this sort of sadomasochistic looking Catwoman. I think they were a bit sort of lost on that one.
Yeah.
But it really does.
I think that's a wonderful story. And I'm sure that Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman is still the definitive Catwoman for me.
Yes. Oh yeah, she stands out. And this is actually something that I thought was quite interesting. So when I decided to do the research on this, I googled it and I put it into YouTube and I put all, just to see what people thought and of Burton as a director and his aesthetic and all those other things. And one of the things that came up quite quick was his it was sort of that thing that happens at the moment, that older films of 30, 40 years old get critiqued under a modern eye, which is fair. But there was this thing of sort of like his representation of women in film. But I and I could be wrong. I'm a white guy, so it's sort of funny. But I always think of the Catwoman arc in Batman Returns as actually, I'd say, quite a strong female empowerment. Possibly not the healthiest way to depict it, but it's still a sort of like, in a sort of twisted Burton word. It's sort of, I still think that as quite a positive arc.
Yeah. Well, I'm not as familiar with the critiques there. What is the through line?
Usually the two things that came up really strongly were that although his films are depicting outsiders or unusual people or these darker elements, normality always wins out. So this thing of sort of like so the examples were given were the Dietz in and the Gina Davis and Adam Baldwin characters Alec Baldwin character in Beetlejuice is all the weird elements by the end of the film have lost. The afterlife has been sort of has been vanquished and isn't part of the house. all the artistic weirdness of the Catherine O'Hara's character has been stripped out of the house, and they're sort of bringing it back to this Middle America. And then the same for Edward Scissorhands, who's this who's created by the Vincent Price Mad Professor, is then brought into a sort of hyper real modern suburban environment, and then they all sort of learn a lesson at the end of it of like, oh yeah, you shouldn't judge people by what they look like, blah blah. But then they all just wander off and go back to their lives, and normality has run out again because he still has to go live in his castle on his own. And in sort of his Batman films, it's the villains that actually are portrayed as the stronger characters. Batman is almost like periphery in some parts. And it's sort of, I thought, yeah, it's true. But what does that say about Burton then, or what is he trying to say? Is he trying to say something about modern society?
Yeah, I mean that strikes me as a little bit like an argument that says, like French New Wave is filled with outsiders, but they mostly die at the end. Well, I mean, it seems to me that is reflective of a pessimistic vision of the outsider's role in society rather than necessarily embracing normality. And I think especially in Beetlejuice, there's truth to that argument, but the flip side is, Lydia's going to school, but, she still comes home and is possessed and does Deo, I mean, they're still wacky. Like, they found a kind of way to sort of, like, integrate wackiness with that suburbia. Whereas, Edward Scissorhands is, poignant to me because it has that ending. It's not going to work out. The world is going to reject this person in a fundamental way. And I grew up in Middle America. I grew up in sort of not a hyper-repressive environment, but certainly I still feel the repression of Middle America and of sort of, white suburbia. So I think maybe it touches me on that personal level.
I agree. I think, Edward, talking to fairy tales really and sort of myth, I feel that Edward Scissorhands is probably one of Burton's like purest films. It feels like pure Burton. The idea that Edward is sort of, it's almost like it's almost like a Beauty and the Beast story. That and Edward is definitely the Beast, and he's brought into the normality, the suburban families and the barbecues, and being able to do sort of like topiary with the hedges and all that kind of stuff, and he starts to find his place, but there's always going to be something that goes wrong. So when he is rejected and when he does escape and he is sent back for whatever, because being sort of set up at the end of it, for me, I think I'm not saying Burton's trying to get deep, but there is that sort of, to me at least, this idea that if Burton is if Edward is that sort of representation of Tim Burton, there is this idea that, well, you can keep trying, but yeah, let's be honest, like, in the film world, in the fairy tale world, something would have happened and they would have lived happily ever after. Like, he would have got his hands, or he would have got, the blue fairy would have granted that wish. He would have become the real boy. But there's that thing of like, well, if you are going to be the freak or the outsider, you're always going to be pushed out. And actually, that's probably more realistic than the Hollywood ending that people would expect. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And keeping on the subject of fairy tales, I think that, that darkness goes back to, the Grimm fairy tales and goes back to the earlier versions of the fairy tales. And I think that, I certainly grew up on the sort of Disney version, right? And the truth is that all of these stories are dark and they get at their best, sort of deeper psychological things, right? I mean, Hansel and Gretel reflect childhood fears of death.
Yeah.
Lots of children dies in those fairy tales. I mean, the fact that you see animals slaughtered and animals die, and you think, I'm an animal, that could happen to me. Children do think that. Children are scared that they're going to die, or their parents are going to die, or that, they can identify with an animal that's used as a food source. And I think that that's some dark stuff that was obviously edited out of the very sanitized, Disney-fied. Yeah. And so I think that, I agree that Edward Scissorhands is, I was thinking, what is peak Burton? I think Edward Scissorhands is certainly one of my favorites. I think it's, a spectacular sort of iconic movie. I also think of Mars Attacks, but that's less of a fairy tale and more just Burton being crazy, which I kind of love. But I think everything you say about Edward Scissorhands is right on the money.
I just think when I looked through and I tried to decide which ones I would say were fairy tales, there was, like you say, I love Mars Attacks. I think Mars Attacks is a great film, and I couldn't. I sort of struggled to fit it into the sort of to the category. But I definitely thought of like Edward Scissorhands, Sleepy Hollow, Corpse Bride, but even Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice felt to me like that sort of like the Hansel and Gretel or Alice in Wonderland, like the characters. I can't remember their names, but the Gina Davis and Baldwin character sort of. They do, their death is never depicted. You see, you sort of, what happened to them, but they stepped literally at one point through a portal into a completely different world, into the afterlife, and it sort of. Then it becomes a journey through, these trials and tribulations of the absolute lunacy, and you get the sort of the guide that Beetlejuice plays is, you could see him represented. He's like the Rumpelstiltskin, or he's that character that does turn up in fairy tales. That he is a main character, but he's definitely a villain.
Oh yeah, I agree, and I think that's a responsible reading of Beetlejuice. I don't have any problem with any of that. I think even although it's ultimately a happy story, I thought Pee-wee's Big Adventure could be fit in there. As maybe sort of like an episodic fairy tale. But it definitely occurs in this kind of like weird world in which, just bizarre adventures happen and everyone comes together at the end. But, and it winds up being a kind of like Hollywood fairy tale that winks at that Disneyfication more than goes against it like, sort of classic Burton fairy tales. But I can certainly see both of those movies.
Yeah, I think with Pee-wee's Big Adventure being sort of his directorial debut, I think I say it's that first stepping away from, because he was a Disney animator, wasn't he? And you can sort of see that in the film. It's that first cheeky stepping away from the Disneyfication. So I mean, the irony for me that he's now directing Dumbo for this year, and he did Alice in Wonderland in 2010 for Disney, isn't lost. To be doing go on.
And I think that is part of the problem of sort of Burton's reception. I mean, I think that there is some revisionist history going on, like we talked about, sort of looking at Beetlejuice and Batman and seeing representational issues and maybe, it's dark, but more dark fairy tales and, gritty realism of Nolan or something. But I think that, Burton, especially since sort of like Planet of the Apes, he's been sort of like the go-to guy for kind of magic of just a bizarre, otherworldly feeling.
Yeah.
And, so, I mean, if you have that kind of movie, your perfect director is Tim Burton. And I sort of see Alice in Wonderland in that context as sort of like, the cliche is like, oh, it's a weird kind of quirky Tim Burton movie. And I think that's a little unfair, but at the same time, there are ways in which he's kind of become a sanitized, parody of himself in some of his lesser stuff.
No, I agree, and I think when he does the bigger studio pieces nowadays, I think, but the thing is, I think still some of his sort of, like you say, his darkness and cheekiness, that sort of like, if you want to say that Beetlejuice pokes his head through every now and then, and you sort of get glimpses of it. I mean, in the 2010 Alice in Wonderland, and I know it's part of the story, but it's clearly depicted in the film, is you find out why the Hatter is mad. Mm-hmm. You find that he actually lived through what is tantamount to a massacre. And his madness is related to like PTSD, and then in the same with like the his Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Again, Depp playing it, but it's that sort of thing of like you learn more about. There's an underlying sort of depiction of Willy Wonka and his childhood and why he is the way he is, and you get that little bit of darkness again that. And I know people always go on about the Gene Wilder one and how good it is, but I still think there's still Depp plays a creepy Michael Jackson version of Willy Wonka, but there's a knowingness in his look, and every now and then there are sort of scenes that have played out that you think, actually, this has still got a darkness and an undertone that is true Tim Burton. But then it's overwashed by a musical number and it's gone away and you think, oh, well, there it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I actually love that movie. I don't think it's a great movie, but I agree with you completely, and Willy Wonka is that kind of fairy tale guide, but he has that darkness, as you say. And I think that, I think Johnny Depp talked about how... his character hates kids. Mm. I mean, he, not only is awkward, but just really resents kids.
Yeah.
And that's why, he's content for them to die. And ultimately he comes around to Charlie. But, I also just kind of loved, I mean, I am a giant Oingo Boingo fan. Mm. And so I love, the Tim Burton scores, and I love kind of like getting, 5 or 6 kind of late Boingo songs that weren't. And that movie just turns into a sort of like weird Oingo Boingo music video at multiple points. And I love that. I mean, I love how crazy that is. And I mean, I think it took me maybe watching it for the first time, sort of like half the movie to sort of get what was being done here. And then I just realized, it's just Burton being weird and making the Oingo Boingo musical or something. Mm. And then I just loved it. But even that, I mean, the Boingo stuff isn't as much a fairy tale, but it is sort of like the same sense of wonder in those sequences and rejection of realism.
And I think that's the really good point is, when you think of fairy tales, it is that rejection of realism. You say these fairy tale stories, and people do think princesses in castles and that sort of thing. But like you say, there are more folklore-based fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. But those sort of more grounded ones that when you go back to the sort of Brothers Grimm versions, they are a lot. They're darker and I mean, like I say in Cinderella, the ugly sisters, one of them actually tries to cut her own toes off so she can fit a foot into the slipper. You know, that doesn't happen in the Disney version. It's and you definitely see that there's that darker element. And I think again, I watched Corpse Bride not long ago, and I love both Nightmare Before Christmas and Corpse Bride and Frankenweenie. I think are fantastic. I love the animation style, the sort of the Leica stop motion animation. But in that, like the thing as well, sort of from Burton's point of view, is the real world, the living world in Corpse Bride is depicted in its grey, drab, you know, sort of frustrating, and the musical sort of tones and numbers are sort of very sort of bass driven, like dum 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 dum. And then when you go to the afterworld, when you go to the underworld, it's all colourful, and the musical numbers are jazz numbers, and there's sort of, you know, Danny Elfman gets to sing a song, and it's all crazy, and you sort of think, and everyone, you know, when you get to the end of that film, and Victor ends up with you know, his bride, the right bride, not the corpse bride, and she's sort of released, and spoilers. It's you know, people go, oh, it's a happy ending, and you sort of go, yeah, but now Victor knows, has got this knowledge of, you know, how amazing things are. A lot of people have got this knowledge of how amazing the afterlife is, but he's still got to live in this drab, you know, sort of like frustrating existence where he's a fishmonger's son married into bankrupt aristocracy. And it's sort of, you know, it's that thing of like, well, love conquers all. Yeah, but the Tim Burton's still telling you that it's still drab and it's still going to be...
Right.
And it's sort of, it's interesting to sort of say, you know, it's still there, that those sort of little notions of... I think you just got, you know, sometimes you've just got to sort of go, well, what comes next? And I think, you know, it's the same with... So going back to Edward Scissorhands... Edward goes back to the castle, or back to the mansion, and then you see Winona Ryder's character decades later, and she's relaying the story. And it is a fairy tale, because she's explaining why does it snow here, you know, and this notion of him sort of like chiseling away at ice and stuff.
Yeah.
And so the notion of she's got older, and she's lived through, and you assume she's lived through this suburban lifestyle, and she might have married the jock, quarterback, or whatever. But Edward's lived in that castle, never aging and never doing whatever. So he's had to live, you know. So you think, oh, it is a sad ending, and it is sort of a bit of a downbeat ending. But you know, well, what happens after that? Like, is he immortal then? Is he to live forever, tortured in this castle? You know, and it's sort of but it's like you say, it's the questions you don't ask about fairy tales. That, you know, you sort of think, actually, these are sort of more grim modern fairy tales than the Disneyfication that you know, that has happened.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, a couple things occur to me. One is that there's no doubt whom you're supposed to identify with, right? I mean, you identify with the outsiders. They're the good guys.
Yeah.
You know, you identify with, you know, the netherworld, right? Those are always the interesting characters.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little complicated in Beetlejuice because, you know, you have the sort of suburban characters who are good guys and kind of eccentric, but plain. But mostly, you know, I mean, there's no doubt whom you're supposed to identify with. And, you know, the other thing that occurs to me is that in fairy tales, the sort of fairy tale logic is very intuitive, right? You know, it's like this, you know, the best fairy tales might not make sense, but they feel as if they express a deeper truth, or they feel right. It feels emotionally right, even if it just doesn't make sense logically. And I feel like that, you know, point you made about the snow and Edward Scissorhands, boy, I mean, that feels rich and wonderful, and it feels right. Even though, you know, it makes no sense. I mean, how far are these ice chips spreading, you know?
Yeah.
You know, none of this, you know, I mean, there's a castle on the hill, for God's sake. I mean, you know, none of this makes any sense in a realistic setting, right? But feels just emotionally connective, and it has that. It might be a bit of a downer ending, but I think the best love stories are always tragedies, right?
Yes.
If the couple lives happily ever after, that's nice, but those aren't the love stories we remember, right?
Mm. Well, that's it. I mean, yeah, like you say, your Romeo and Juliet's and that sort of thing. The tragedies are the ones that sort of stand the test of time, and I agree. And that's what I think. I think you're totally right. I think it's not supposed to be taken in a literal. Like you say, this isn't the Nolan verse. This is the Burton verse. So you sort of say, yeah, it does. If you're trying to apply sort of like that thinking logic to it, it doesn't totally make sense. But like you say, neither does. All the fairy tales, the Beauty and the Beast, that sort of thing. There's magic involved in this, and you go along to be told a story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I keep finding myself thinking of his, a little off subject of fairy tales, but thinking of how, we're describing Burton as this sort of maker of weird, eccentric movies. And it occurs to me that probably his two most realistic, sort of normal movies are Ed Wood, which is amazing,
yeah,
and Big Eyes, which is a solid movie. And both of them still, nonetheless, feature sort of outsiders who, I think of Ed Wood all the time. I mean, especially. As a creator, the sort of nobody cares if the tombstones are knocked over. It's the idea that counts. And finding, like his just going for what he wanted to depict. Is obviously celebrated in that movie, and yet, as a creator myself, I often think of that and trying to find a kind of middle ground between like. Okay, this isn't exactly what I envisioned, but am I getting that core idea across? Am I conveying the emotional truth of the scene rather than just the factual truth? And I think that my brain and my training has been so structural and has been so on the Nolan side of sort of like puzzle narratives, right? And I think that tends to be what the Academy lionizes most and what gets the sort of like high praise.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to be said for just what works emotionally, and I think that even in those more realistic films, they work emotionally, and Burton goes for these scenes that not only feature outsiders, but have that kind of emotional connection that maybe ties back to the fairy tale choices.
I agree. Actually, Ed Wood's is an interesting choice because I don't know. Having seen Big Eyes quite a while ago, I don't know enough about the truth, the actual biography to weigh it up. But having sort of like looked into Ed Wood and that sort of thing, and I know that sort of whilst the events happen in the right order, pretty much, and there's some of the in these films things have to be contracted, and characters sometimes have to be sort of amalgamated and that sort of thing. But the depiction that Johnny Depp gives of Ed Wood, is clearly not supposed to be a down pat impression of Ed Wood. It's not supposed to be. But the film feels, like you say, from a logic point of view, sort of a fairy tale logic or a storytelling logic. It's a biography, it's a biopic that's been taken and turned into sort of something else. It's telling me something else, more about the creators at that point, about an irrepressible creator who just wants to create and, just get his ideas out. And I sort of feel that, again, it's that sort of Johnny Depp as Ed Wood is stepping in to be Tim Burton in some cases of like, I know this is crazy, but look, I've got this idea and I want to do it and I want to try and do this, and I've got this person who's going to do this for me, and there's an energy there that it's probably not completely accurate to Ed Wood in the 50s, but do you know what, to Tim Burton in the early 80s, it's probably spot on.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's obviously what Tim Burton loves about Ed Wood. I mean, it's sort of less about Ed Wood than it is sort of what Ed Wood means to me. In the same way that, again, I come back to the unfairness of how Burton gets a little pigeonholed. But, how I know so many people who just, adore David Lynch. Because David Lynch is weird, and it doesn't have to make sense, and they won't apply those same things to Burton. Burton is just the punchline of a joke because he does weird movies or something. But I was thinking, apropos of Ed Wood, of sort of Ed Wood is that fairy tale character that he's a little like the Edward Scissorhands, who grew up in that mundane gray world, right? And of course it's in black and white. It's still like, he's not really from this world, right? He's from something a little sideways to our reality. But he's made his place in the mundane world, and he's never accepted it, right? He's never acclimated himself to any of the necessities of filmmaking or anything.
I know, he's going to do it his way, and I mean the scene at the end, sort of towards the end of the film, I think it may be the final scene, is that he's doing Plan 9 from Outer Space, or one of those other films, and it's being backed by a Christian group, and they're trying to sort of keep telling him he can't do this, can't do that, script, and he comes out of his dressing room dressed as in his female clothes, in the women's clothes, and sort of has a bit of a strop about it and storms off. And they're sort of stunned and left to be like, I don't know what to make of this. And maybe not to that extent, but again, I can sort of feel that there would have been that frustration when Burton was making probably films like Beetlejuice and the first Batman film, where he's saying, right, we're going to do this, and it's going to look like this, and I want the soundstage is going to look like this with these angles and da 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 da. And people are going, well, you can't do that, and you can't do that, and it's not going to work, or you can't do this and that. And again, I can sort of see that it's just that energy of like creation and creativity that Burton's trying to express and be that outsider that he feels he really is. And it makes me wonder, as you say, about sort of the more recent films, to sort of say, and maybe I might be wrong, but has he given in to, as he's got older, as he sort of compromised more? I'm not saying sold out, he's kept his aesthetic, but has he compromised more to accept that Hollywoodness in his films?
Yeah, I don't know about that, and I feel it depends on the movie.
Yeah.
And I remember, looking back, I'm looking at the list now, and I think that I sort of loved everything through maybe Mars Attacks.
Yeah.
And then, Sleepy Hollow kind of left, obviously that's very literally a sort of adaptation of a fairy tale. But, sort of left me cold. It was sort of like, a little more, just kind of what you were describing of the sort of Hollywood touches on the story, and didn't give me those kind of Burton characters that I like to identify with. And then you get to like Planet of the Apes, and that's not good.
Yeah.
I think Big Fish is wonderful. I really dig Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Corpse Bride. Sweeney Todd kind of left me a little Sweeney Todd and Alice in Wonderland. It kind of left me a little not in love. And, I love Frankenweenie. I think Dark Shadows is okay. I like Big Eyes, but it doesn't feel like Burton. I don't know. I feel like, like Big Eyes, I liked a lot, but it doesn't have that kind of classic Burton magic. And I don't know what's going on. If obviously on something like Alice in Wonderland, it's a big enough project that there are more eyes on him. and obviously Disney is known for micromanaging things.
Yeah.
And I feel like, especially in the era of the sort of Marvel blockbuster, I mean, things are a little different at Warner's, but they make their own terrible mistakes. But we're kind of in this era in which a movie can make $1 billion. And if a movie can make $1 billion, it has to be kind of test marketed and focus grouped in a way that obviously Beetlejuice was not.
Yeah.
Obviously Batman was not. Edward Scissorhands was not. And I feel like maybe it's that Hollywood culture that he's kind of running up against.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's looking at the list. There are films that sort of, like you say, like, as I said before, there's like flashes. Like you get Big Fish, and what it seems like he's allowed to do more when it comes to the animation. So, like you say, you get like Corpse Bride, Frank, and I love Frankenweenie. I think it's fantastic. And
I do too.
It's obviously based on his he did a short for it. It's one of the first things he did. Such a good film. It's sort of his homage to Universal monsters and 50s B movies and all that sort of thing, and it's brilliant.
I agree completely, and I saw that when I was a kid. I tracked down I rented the VHS of the short Frankenweenie.
Oh really?
I've
seen it on YouTube now. It's really good.
Oh yeah.
And I do think Frankenweenie, and it's actually on the Blu-ray now. I've seen it as well. So, it's a thing of and it has that sort of, again, that fairy tale logic. It's a sci-fi, daft romp for kids, but it still has that element that he still clearly wants to tell those fairy tales, and he clearly loves them. But it's like you say, Hollywood seems to get in the way when it's obviously got a real budget associated to it. So I'd love him to do more animation and do some more, especially work with a company like Leica that I think do great work. Especially, I think we seem to get away with more. Darker fairy tales are definitely now being played out in animation, and I do think of things like Corpse Bride. I think of Coraline, which I think is absolutely another wonderful one. Kubo and the Two Strings, and even when you look at sort of some of the stuff that comes out of Studio Ghibli and that sort of thing, those darker sort of modern fairy tales, I think they're still there, and I think I just wish Burton would probably do something more in that vein. What do you think?
Well, I agree. I think that I would personally rather see him do a mix of animation like that, which I agree completely that there's an audience for, and maybe lower budget movies. I don't need Burton's take on Alice in Wonderland. I don't think it's a bad movie per se, but I don't need it. I don't need his take on Planet of the Apes.
Yeah. Nobody needs his take on Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, well, at Seclet we did a Planet of the Apes book that talked about it and how it's not as bad as people think, but it's not good.
No.
Yeah, and so, I don't know. I kind of have this idea of, people will say they don't like Burton, or, and I'll say, I like, when Burton's just let loose. I love Mars Attacks. Mars Attacks follows no narrative logic. It just embraces every cliche, and Tom Jones is in there because Burton likes Tom Jones. It's the same reason why Danny Elfman has a, perpetual music scoring career. Burton likes interesting stuff, and I'm not a big Tom Jones fan, but I love how much love Burton has for him, and shows him in that movie. And I kind of, I feel the same way about, obviously an inferior director compared to Burton, but, in a lot of ways. But Zack Snyder, Punch Drunk is what is it? Sucker Punch is the best Zack Snyder movie because there's nothing deep about it, but it plays with some ideas, and it's just like a 2-hour-long music video, and that's what he does great. Let them make that. They don't need to. I don't need their version of whatever. Just be yourself. Make the most Tim Burton movies possible, and I don't care if it was made for $20 million or $200.
I think you're right, and I think there are directors that I do. I think when you see their name, I go, "Ooh, what are they doing?" And I'll have a look. And if you think it's if it's too Hollywood, I'll either roll my eyes or I'll sort of like, well, maybe. But if I think if they're doing an independent thing or they're doing their own thing, I'll give it a look. And I think Tim Burton's definitely one of them. Zack Snyder is one. I will always sort of say because I love I do think he's got a really good eye. But the other one, like Robert Rodriguez, is another that can do some really interesting things, but has a tendency. Then has a tendency to sort of fall in and do something that's really commercial, and it just feels lesser. And then you get guys that sort of stand by their gun and always do their own weird thing, like Terry Gilliam, who will never be a huge Hollywood director, but has made some amazing films.
Absolutely.
And I think we talked about, and when I think about Big Fish, as well, I do think Big Fish is an interesting sort of comparison piece to something like Baron Munchausen. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, and that idea of tall tales being told, and the way it sort of, and the way you said about the no narrative logic. Like I really enjoy The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. I think it's a great film, but it follows no logical sense. Like by the end of that film, I've seen that film plenty of times. I'm still not entirely sure, like how the ending sort of fits together and stuff like that. It's brilliant.
Yeah, but that's part of its charm, right?
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. And that's definitely a trilogy. So that's a trilogy we'll get into at some point.
Yeah, but I mean that's part of the problem of Hollywood. I mean, if you're going to do something that is that potentially commercial, I mean, look, and I don't blame them in a sense. I mean, if you're going to invest $200 or $300 million. I mean, that is a huge investment, and that has to make a lot of money. That has to make $600 million easy worldwide to justify it.
Yeah.
And they don't get a bailout. Nobody's running to bail out, Hollywood when it banks on a dumb movie. We just make fun of those choices, right?
Yeah.
And so, I understand why, it gets put through this kind of process that often feels like it turns everything into, processed American cheese or something. It goes through a kind of meat grinder. But I understand that. Part of the problem now is that there's not, we have some art films, but we don't have that mid-range that we used to. And it used to be the case that there was just the spectrum between an absolute indie film produced on $10,000 and something produced for 50 or 60 million. A couple decades ago. And now it's kind of all blockbusters or art house films, and that it's hard to get Hollywood interested in a $30 million movie.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Like I say, that was sort of the ground that was like a company like Miramax filled. That was their ground. They were sort of the indie directors. Sort of, from that mid to late 90s, that was their thing. They were the ones that sort of they supported like your Tarantinos, your Kevin Smiths, and even some like your David Lynch's. That they gave them the money to make those small, weird, mid-range films that weren't going to have the multi-million-dollar appeal, but they were definitely going to make the money back because those people wanted to see those directors make a film, and they could sort of go out and do what they wanted to do and tell the stories they wanted to tell. And that's what's missing, I think. No, you're right. Yeah. But yeah, I think there's potential for it to come back because Hollywood is risking, like I say, hundreds of millions of dollars on films that just aren't making the money anymore. I mean, already this year they've got a couple of films that have already been banked as predetermined flops. Alita, Battle Angels due to come out in a week or two, and already it's considered. They're saying it's going to be a huge flop. That's why they put it out in January, and you just think, well, why? What who was the audience for? You take the mickey out of the decisions. Like, well, why have you put all this technology and all this sort of funding into a film that I don't think anyone was actually asking for? Like, no one was clamoring for it, but also it's not a story that anyone particularly wanted to be told.
Right.
There are some odd choices being made, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember when directors were complaining that their films were being judged on opening weekend, and it wasn't. The assumption used to be it was going to play for anywhere from 3 months to a year, and you're probably going to get a good 6-month run out of it, and we'll see how it does. And then they were complaining about they're being told it's a flop on opening weekend, and you can run those projections based on that opening weekend, with a cone of market diminishing audiences for each given weekend, and kind of have a range of what it's going to be. And very few movies ever defy that.
And if you see an article that says, "Oh, this film's going to be a flop," then already it's being tarred with a brush that says it's not going to be very good. So I'm not going to bother going to see it because it cost me £15 to go to the cinema. I'll wait till something else comes out. So it almost becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy at times as well, which is unfortunate. But I feel that at the moment, the last couple of years has been. There have been some great films. I've really enjoyed some films, but there's been a lot of like big and bland. Like they're very big and they're very fun and they're very sort of, the stories are great, the special effects are great, and the actors are all very good, and but there's nothing unique.
Yeah.
Really, and people might tell me I'm wrong, and I don't know about yourself, but I just feel that there's very little unique in the cinema at the moment.
Yeah, and the strange thing is that. Going back to Batman, it's so strange to see Hollywood so dominated by. I mean, I wish there were more sci-fi. I mean, I was thinking of the failure of Valerian, which I love despite some flaws. Where they lost so much money on that. But we have all these superhero movies. I mean, no longer are we in, and we also have trans characters. We have, when Johnny Depp was playing Ed Wood, that was the simple fact that he, quote unquote cross-dresses was a big deal.
Yeah.
That wasn't all that many years from, even Philadelphia in the first, sort of mainstream, breakthrough on that issue. And so, we have a lot more kind of like outsider characters, but and there's a lot more diversity, which is good, but the stories that they're in are all kind of, this kind of processed, as you say, sort of spectacles, and and there isn't as much room for that unique direction, or for a new Burton to come up and say, I want to do a weird fairy tale about a guy with scissors for hands, and you're going to try to sell that to McDonald's or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I think the most recent comparable director for me, just we were talking then, is Guillermo del Toro. He's with the Shape, the Shape of Water. I think that's sort of something where you could, that's something akin to sort of the Shape of Water, and I think he's another one that when he's given the ability to do what he wants, he makes something amazing. You know, and it's not always perfect, but he makes something really interesting. And I think when you talk about superheroes, I think his Hellboy is really good. Especially, you know, got the remake coming out, or the reboot coming out, but the aesthetic he gave to, especially in Hellboy 2, when, you know, you go to the underground, like, monster market, and all using practical effects and all that kind of thing. You know, his monster effects are fantastic. Same for The Shape of Water, and Pan's Labyrinth, and even Crimson Peak, which I thought was a really good, beautiful gothic romance horror story. You know, and everyone sort of goes, "Oh yeah, you know, it's good," and then, you know, he still gets to make Pacific Rim, which is one of the biggest, dumbest films I think of the last sort of 10 years.
Right.
And so, you know, I think it's almost like you've got to pander to Hollywood every now and then to be allowed to do your piece. But I just wish there was more doing their piece. Less Michael Bay's, more Del Toro's.
You know, and I think that there is a kind of model in which, you see it in comics too, of sort of like, I'm going to do, you know, a run on Batman, and I'm also going to do this indie thing on the side, or this creator-owned thing on the side. And I think sometimes, like, you know, that expresses itself with, you know, people doing sort of franchise movies, and then between them, they used to do an Edward Scissorhands, or they used to do, you know, they would do an Inception or whatever. But now they're turning, you know, the studios want those blockbusters every year. They want, you know, the next Marvel installment. You know, it's got to be turned around in 2-3 years at most. So there's not necessarily as much time for that. And I think the model of Del Toro, who I love, in much the same way, is a good model there.
Yeah, but my worry is that the last couple of years have also shown, and I reluctantly use the word auteur, because I don't think they are auteur directors, but directors with a certain aesthetic have worked on films, franchise films, and then been kicked off because they've tried to lead into their sort of their tastes and their aesthetics. And I mean, I think of the the two guys from the Lego movie that were originally planned to do Solo, and I'm trying to think, there's been a couple of others that have had these experiences, and it's, you know, again, it's when you look at these franchise films, studios don't want an aesthetic, and they don't want an auteur. They want someone, a safe pair of hands, who Ron Howard, for want of a better phrase, who is going to come in and be, get it through, get it done on time, on budget, and do it so direct the actors to do something good, but get it out. And it makes me worried that, like I say, these directors that could provide something new and interesting are actually going to be waylaid because of the fear that, you know, these experiences have put on the studios. And so you won't even get those sort of things in the big Hollywood films anymore. I think James Wan is probably the only example I can give of him, you know, being someone who's got a bit of an eye and making it big in Hollywood.
Yeah, and I think that, that was also the case with Ant-Man, right? Of
yes,
leaving that.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the Marvel Studios, you know, I mean, I always come back to that as the example of everything that's wrong with Hollywood, which is not entirely fair. But you know, they hire these, they hire the, you know, young Tim Burton, the young person who has a strange eye, and then they say, you're not going to direct any of the action sequences.
Yeah.
You know, those are going to be directed by a B unit. And even though you're the director, I mean, you're going to have some control, but, here's the script that, you know, or here's the plot that we basically envision. It's going to follow the same sort of character arc, and it's got to work in these references to these other movies. And then, how much room is there for, really having your own vision and going crazy and producing, an 89 Batman or whatever.
Well, I think that's the difference. You're right, because although I do like the Marvel films, and I will be, in the line to see Avengers Endgame with everybody else. And I think you're right. I find that Marvel's gone the cookie cutter route, and it's paid off in many respects. It's paid off in billions overall. But the fact of the matter is, it is actually coming to a point where, yeah, all right, well, we know, I can guess what's going to happen. It's going to be this, it's going to be that. We're going to see Chris Evans do this, and we're going to see Scarlett Johansson do that, and it's going to be great. But what longevity does that have? However, whilst a lot of what Warner Brothers has been a bit of a train wreck, when they have lent into what those directors can do, which is what they've tried to do, you actually do get some really interesting films. Like Man of Steel has got its problems. I agree. But actually, it's actually a pretty good film. And then you've sort of got Patty Jenkins doing Wonder Woman, and it's a great film.
Right, yeah.
And you get James Wan doing Aquaman, and it's a batshit crazy film. It's nuts. It doesn't fit. But then those three films do not fit together.
Right.
In any way, shape, but they all exist in the same universe apparently, but they're meant, But like you say, it's and I kind of like that as a bit of a model as well, where those directors have been given the ability, and there will have been some control, but those directors have been given a level of control to say, no, you go do what you want to do, and either have it that you're going to have a Kraken sort of voiced by Julie Andrews, or you're going to have, Wonder Woman fighting Ares with a tank, or whatever's going to happen. It's you're going to do those things, and then we'll come together and do the Justice League, whatever. But it feels a bit more like I said, they're going down that auteur route that I feel Disney, Marvel Studios, Lucasfilm, that conglomerate is really moving away from, because they're going towards that cookie cutter. Bland vanilla approach.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think that there's outside of Wonder Woman, I would probably say those Marvel Studio films are better on average than the DC expanded universe, but I see shots in those movies where you're seeing like soldiers go through a forest, and the camera's upside down, and the image is upside down, and it rotates around to, be right side up. And I think that would never be allowed in a Marvel movie. Just that unique eye, just doing something different, even just with a camera, that, that would not make it through the Marvel process. Apparently Marvel's relaxing about that kind of stuff, but it gets down to, camera angles.
Yeah. Well, the example I can think of, and I'm just sort of checking it now, is that the Harry Potter franchise is actually a really good example. I think it's the films, they really didn't know what they were going to be. They weren't sure how it was going to pan out. It was a bit of a gamble when Warner Brothers did it, and so you have like Chris Columbus makes the first two. Very safe pair of hands. He can do that. That sort of wonderful chart. He can work with that. Children actors. He can do that sort of magical world, and they're great. And they're sort of they're a really good introduction to the film franchise. And then they introduce the third film, and you get Alfonso Cuarón do the third film, Prisoner of Azkaban, and it's a completely different aesthetic, and it's like it's got that dark European feel to it, and it's brilliant. And you think, oh, they're really going to lean into, they're really going to lean into this. This looks like it could be fantastic. And then all of a sudden, after that, you get Mike Newell doing the fourth one, and then David Yates sort of like finishes off the franchise, and they're not bad, don't get me wrong, but they become very, they become something different. they sort of move more towards the Nolan influence.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I really enjoy the Harry Potter films. I feel that there's a magic and that's lost. That they moved more towards reality when they could have moved completely into the outer realm, and it could have been something completely different. And I do think, again, that's a Hollywood choice. That's a studio choice that was made to make it more relatable or whatever.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that there's a joy. This all ties back to us wanting to see more wacky Burton films. That there's a joy to seeing something that you think, this is not processed. This is not a studio choice. And there is a kind of depressed feeling that sets in. As you realize, oh, this is a studio decision. I mean, and I get that way a lot when, now we have a sort of plethora of these outsider characters, but they're all kind of like, they don't have edges to them. I just feel like they're wisecracking, but their wisecracks are like, they're edgy TM. They're like the Disney version of edgy. They're the edgy that has been test marketed, and no one in that audience said, "This is outrageous, I'm leaving." Right?
Yeah, it's the sanitized version, isn't it? It's the safest possible version that they could produce.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I get really kicked out by that, and I get really upset as I realize, you're doing all the things that indicate we're about to come up to a fight scene climax or something, and I'm now in the climax of the movie. Now I will have to sit here for 15 minutes before anyone says anything interesting.
Yeah.
Those are bad movie experiences for me. And those moments, even if I don't like a movie, where I think, how did, I've never seen this before. How did this get through? This is maybe mind-numbingly bad, but it's so uniquely itself that I'm won over.
Yes. And that's it. I think every now and then those films do come out, and you sort of go, "Oh yeah, this," and people jump to them to sort of go, "Oh, it's so unique and it's so sort of thing." Is that sometimes they get overhyped and that sort of thing, and I think that's a shame. But again, because there's not enough of them, and I don't think, like I say, studios aren't taking chances on these directors that But as you say, let's go back to Beetlejuice. Like Beetlejuice, if that was to be released today as a new film, people would go absolutely nuts. Like the character of Beetlejuice is disgusting. Like he's clearly, he's clearly sexually abusive. He blackmails them. But then there's also jokes about suicide. There's jokes about, injury, family loss. It's crazy. That film, it could be, if you were to release it, would be hugely offensive, and people would be triggered all over the place. But you take it and you go, actually, it's supposed to be that. Like no one in that film is, apart from the sort of the two protagonists, the Gina Davis and Alec Baldwin characters. Like even Winona Ryder to Lydia Deetz. No one in that film is actually a particularly nice person. None of them, the sort of, even Lydia Deetz, sort of like, they portray that she's writing a suicide letter, but then she scribbles some of it out to make it more emotionally, more sort of emotionally appealing,
gut-wrenching.
Yeah, and you think, well, she's clearly doing this just to get attention. Like she's not suffering. She's clearly not suffering from a mental illness. Like this isn't suicide due to depression or schizophrenia or anything like that. This is just, I'm a bored Hollywood, a California kid that's not getting the attention from her parents. It just, it's not until the end that she actually feels like an authentic person. Like she feels disingenuous even then. Like she would be going to Hot Topic and buying all the bits and pieces to look like a goth, but really it's sort of like, you know, it's not really there. She's just doing there to annoy people.
Scott, I recognize the truth of everything you're saying, but having seen Beetlejuice recently, I'm so completely in love with Winona Ryder.
Yes.
And with Lydia. I mean, I just, she's so utterly charming. But everything you're saying is objectively right. And I like the Hot Topic analogy there. It's true. But
that's the truth. But she's just a teenager, and she is a troubled teenager looking to act out. And so, you know, yeah, she might be disingenuous as a goth or as a you know, or whatever. But she's doing it for a reason. Like, she's got her own reasons. And I like the fact that actually she sort of, by the end of the film, it's toned down, and actually she's able to be a bit more, what I would say would be herself. Like, yeah, she's still got those tendencies, but, you know, she doesn't feel like she has to act out as much. But no, I agree. I think she's fantastic in the film. And I just wish though that that fairy tale element and all these things would be, and maybe Netflix is the way that this could be saved. You know, and Netflix is putting money into things that are a bit more edgy and a bit more unique, and they're trying their hand at different things. And maybe that'll be the way it forward for these directors to do their little projects and their pet pieces that they want to do.
Well, and it certainly does seem that television is becoming that place. But, you know, I was thinking of, you know, the point you were making about how Beetlejuice is edgy in that way. And I was thinking, like, of the contrast between, say, Beetlejuice and Deadpool. Deadpool seems really edgy, but really it's a bunch of fart and penis jokes.
Yeah.
And there's some clever stuff, like with the title sequence, and, you know, I definitely liked the movie, but there are things that I hate. And everything that I hated was exactly that kind of, like, it's too in love with that particular joke and thinks it's much more edgy than it really is. Whereas Beetlejuice is making jokes about suicide and, you know, sex, and, you know, it's there's an edge to that. And then I find myself thinking about how, you know, if fairy tales sort of like have an instructive role for children, right? That, like, fairy tales were one of the ways in which we sort of like learn to conceive the world, whether it's that we want to be a Disney princess or, you know, whatever it is. You know, I think children can handle, not that Burton's movies are really for children, but children can handle some of that edginess. Children can handle, they have thoughts about death. I mean, you know, we've gone through this kind of like Mr. Rogers renaissance, and Mr. Rogers said the same thing, you know, that children can handle these issues. They have these questions. And, you know, and I think that it's healthy to present a sort of a little edgy, a little weird, you know, a little troubling, you know, something that kids are going to ask about, or at least ask their friends, you know, what does this mean? Why is Catwoman dressed like that? You know, do you like Edward Scissorhands? You know, is that the kind of guy who you would like? Is she the kind of girl? You know, I mean, these are questions that I think it helps us, you know, at a certain age to sort of define ourselves. And I do sometimes worry about the sort of processed, you know, culture that we're talking about. Obviously, obviously things are better in a lot of ways, right? I mean, but there is a kind of processed effect that, you know, I don't know is healthier, and maybe that sort of like edgy, dark fairy tale where things, you know, like the nether worlds that Burton provides are really scary, terrible places, right? I mean, they're wonderful, but I mean, you know, you have like Oogie Boogie in Nightmare Before Christmas, and he's a lot scarier than like most of these Disney villains, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, they take him apart. I love that. They take him apart, and he's filled with insects. That's what creates him. It's wonderful, and the animation's amazing. But when we talk about this again, I think it's about the sanitation of it, and the sanitization of it. I should say is. I look back and I think of films, I watched as a kid growing up that scared me, but I went back to, and two that sort of stick out to me is Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal. Both sort of related to Henson puppetry and that sort of thing. But there's elements, the idea of like the Goblin King stealing a child and having to go off to the sort of Goblin Kingdom, and some of the stuff in Labyrinth is nuts. Like, it makes no sense, and some of it's really like quite unnerving. And the same with The Dark Crystal, like the villainous characters in that. There's like vulturous characters are terrifying. Really, now I watch it in respect, but I was watching as a kid and thinking like, this is amazing. I love this. This is great. And there's a whole load of like political backstabbing and betrayal goes on in sort of The Dark Crystal, and it's sort of I feel it's weird that I think kids' films. This is what I'm saying. You become an adult and you lose that ability. Well, lose it, but some people lose that ability to have that imagination, and they feel they almost have to become like a guardian or like a custodian of what is and isn't safe for kids. But then when you look at these things, like you say, the Grimm fairy tales were told to kids for a purpose, and before they became the Disneyfication or the Disneyfied versions, they were dark and they were grim, and like literally grim and full of murder and mutilation and child abduction and cannibalism and all this other stuff. And I think some of that does live on in some films, but the people, like you say, the sort of the Mary Whitehouse or the sort of who will think of the children kind of people have been able to stop a lot of that in modern cinema and modern storytelling.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that it filters up now. I mean, and I think that one of the I often think about. Well, I'm going to circle back to Burton, but I often think about how, growing up, I took comics seriously, and not just superheroes, but certainly superheroes, and I believe that these stories, whether they were superheroes or they were just weird fantasy and sci-fi comics and novels, were as good or could be as good as anything literary or acknowledged as a masterpiece of cinema. But I took it as that was the objective, right? Was to make stuff that, whether it was a masterpiece of realism or a masterpiece of German expressionism, that it was a masterpiece on that level. And I think that Burton was sort of part of the acceptance of genre, of recognition that those movies could be not just blockbusters, because obviously they were already with stuff like Star Wars, but there was a kind of legitimization of those genres and those weird stories that Burton was a part of. And I think now those stories sort of dominate the box office, they dominate popular culture, but with rare exceptions, and there certainly are exceptions, and they're not really made for adults. They're not really trying to be great masterpieces of cinema. It's almost as if, in taking these things that were seen as childlike stories, whether it's superheroes or fairy tales, and making them more artistic and more for adults, what we got instead of great masterpieces of those genres was the adoption of those genres into a kind of mainstream Hollywood cookie-cutter approach that I feel like now even adult material or material that used to be adult material often feels sanitized to me in a way that I associate with protecting children.
No, I agree, and I think it's that thing of fear of. And it comes down to less. I'll say it's protecting themselves, isn't it? It's that thing of they don't want to trigger anyone. They don't want anyone to be pointing out whitewashing or lack of diversity or use of language or feminism or. And I'm not downplaying any of these issues that exist, and they do exist in Hollywood, but because there's a fear of stepping onto one of these hot trigger these trigger topics, they sort of don't let themselves go, expand their the possibilities or what they could do.
I think that's true, and I think going back to the point you were making about artists being allowed to have a sort of singular vision. Part of having that vision is saying, screw my audience. If they don't, they're not going to like necessarily that this goes in this weird, Terry Gilliam direction, right?
Yeah.
Who thought that the audience is going to buy, its nose because Edward is chipping at the ice, right? Who thought that was a good idea? The audience is gonna buy that and say that is the most successful resolution of that story. Nobody. I mean, maybe there's some of that in Beetlejuice, but it's still weird. And I think that again, there's something to be said for just kind of as much as those are legitimate issues, I think sometimes that there's a kind of I associate it with as a very kind of like American attitude, and it is a very Midwestern attitude, kind of going back to the way in which the Midwest and America can be a place of great freedom and also an oddly repressive kind of suburban black and white gray place.
Yeah.
That people don't want to offend, right? They want people to like them, and I think especially in America, nobody. I mean, to be called a misogynist or a racist, is the end of the world, right? I mean, that's like you can't even like say in public you enjoy those movies anymore without sparking a discussion, and I want to have that discussion. That discussion is good. That discussion is positive for society. But I also think problematic portrayals spark those discussions. And they're going to be problematic portrayals. And there is a responsibility of an artist to say, I mean, you can run this analysis. I mean, I can see that or not as an artist. But at the end of the day, this is the right choice for the story I want to tell, the movie I want to make, the comic I want to do. And if somebody objects to it, that's fine. Which, James Gunn is not, was, who was it, who was so hostile to, it was the director of Last Jedi, right, who said,
yes,
I never learned anything from a critic. Johnson, right?
Yeah, Rian Johnson, that's it, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that there's a middle ground in which we can let stuff be edgy, let it be problematic. Every movie is problematic in a way, and that doesn't mean you have to embrace just the depths of misogyny or racism or anything else. But in as much as any character becomes a representation for an entire class of people, just given how many characters are in the average story, there are going to be problematic depictions. Characters are going to do things that you like or you don't like, or that are good or bad, and people are going to see that in different lights. And we can have those discussions, but we can't be sort of like so scared to obviously it's as much of a problem that people don't want to scare Hollywood or scare, the market, or scare, the parents. as it is, catered to liberal sensitivities or something. I don't want to misrepresent that is the biggest problem.
No, but you make a point, and it just struck me really that we've talked around those mainstream pop culture movies that are trying to appeal to a mass audience, and they're the ones that have become cookie cutter because you've got to get your 4 quadrants, you've got to get your PG-13 rating and all that kind of thing. But when we were talking about, there are still films, I suppose, that do jump out of that thing, but it's in the different genre, and I think horror really is the one that has started to come through, and sort of every now and then just throws out these oddities that is a clear vision. And I think you do get films like Get Out or Mother or Hereditary, where it's because like you say, because it's a lower budget and because there's lower expectations of that genre, and people they seem to forget the stories that it can tell, or the feelings and the emotions it can evoke, that they don't expect much. And then so when one of these films comes out, they're like, oh my god, it's amazing, it's the best thing ever. How is this what but then you get this instant response of, which blockbuster is this director now going to go and make?
Right.
And you sort of think, well, no, why is it oh, I wonder what story this person is going to go tell next. I mean, it's one of the only sort of industries, or the only sort of media where that happens, really, I suppose, because you don't sort of say a comic book writer or artist doesn't jump to a main thing straight away. They get a choice, or just because someone's done something great in an indie thing, it could be Boom Studios or it could be Avatar or even Image, does not mean they're automatically going to get a run on Batman or Superman or Captain America. And it's not spoken about in that way. They're not like there's more of that. They've done an amazing job in their independent work. I can't wait to see what they produce next. It's not a push to go straight to the top, to the big 2 straight away, or for them to even do that. But it seems to be you wouldn't do that. There was no push for. I can't think of sort of like standard book series or that, but it doesn't happen with authors either, but it seems to happen in Hollywood, where the moment you make a good film as a breakout, it's, well, what big film are you going to make next? And I'm very glad that Jordan Peele has gone from Get Out to now making Us for this year, and he's sticking to his sort of smaller horror sort of roots, the stories he wants to tell, and I'm like, that's great, because that's what you should do. And maybe that's where the difference is going to come.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that I agree completely, and I think that the other thing is this lack of a middle ground, right? That, I mean, it is such a bizarre thing to think that somebody goes from a $2 million movie to a $200 million movie, I mean, the 70s is often considered the golden age of cinema, and back then, before Star Wars, I mean, they would say to a director, okay, I mean, you're going to have complete creative control, and we're going to fund this to the tune of what would be today a blockbuster.
Yeah.
And even when Burton was coming up, there was this kind of middle ground where the studio would say, all right, well, you made, $50 million on a, $5 million budget. Let's see what you can do with $25 million. It wasn't jumping directly to, $150 million movie, which then has to get kind of test marketed. And, obviously we're speaking as readers, and we're speaking as members of the audience who like this more innovative or different idiosyncratic stuff. And so we want more of that, and I don't begrudge a creator saying, I mean, I got a check.
Yeah.
I've never been a millionaire, and they offered me $1 million to direct this. I don't begrudge them that, but in the long run, it seems to me that it is the Get Out that's going to be remembered and going to, not necessarily It's not that, a Captain America movie won't be talked about, but or won't continue to get played, but people today still have Jack Skellington tattooed on them. You know?
Yeah.
Millennials have it.
Yeah.
That is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
I mean, as a kid who watched that and and saw it as part of this sort of continuing, maybe there's a place for me in the world. It's staggering to think that this wasn't forgotten, and Disney has now embraced that, and it's at Disneyland and just accepted, and that new blood isn't going to come from not that that's the goal to have an attraction at Disneyland, but that new blood and that level of just people having tattoos and the merchandise still being in Hot Topic for the Lydias of the next generation.
Yeah.
That blows my mind, and that's not going to happen. Nobody's going to remember, whatever it is, Captain America, Civil War, or whatever, for all of its, good points.
Yeah.
In quite the same way.
No, I think it's true. I think that's I think TV, and I do think things like Amazon and Netflix, when they start to fund these films, that they're going to be the ones that are going to say, actually, we've got the opportunity to make something unusual here. Like, go for it. And I think it's starting in horror, and I can think of others, like A Quiet Place last year was another one that's sort of a breakout hit. And they're just doing something different, and I think Netflix is really pushing the boat out now. I mean, this it's terrible to say it, but I haven't seen it yet. But Bandersnatch, the latest thing of Black Mirror, where it's actually interactive and you can choose your path and an ending and all that kind of thing. Where they're really saying, like, okay, well, what can we do with this technology? What can we do with this sort of story that we want to tell? And they're trying something different. Yeah, I turn to the hot, to the whatever's going to be on the cinema. There'll be, it's January, so you're going to get your award season stuff that it might win Best Picture, but will be forgotten within 2 years. Or the junk that the studios have made and thought, actually, it's not going to compete in the summer, so we'll stick it somewhere else. And so there's a sort of a hollowness in Hollywood at the moment that I hope that directors like Tim Burton and Guillermo del Toro and others will move and see the opportunities that there are in these smaller budget but probably more risk-taking companies like Netflix and Amazon.
Yeah, I agree, and I think maybe that will wind up being a kind of new middle ground where, whatever one thinks of Woody Allen, for example, where a director who has a name, who's done, great things, can be snatched up by Amazon or Netflix, and, get a budget of a few $1 million, which is really only, these days, I mean, major television is running, like $2 million an episode easy.
Yeah.
I mean, some of those HBO shows are, 10 million.
Yeah.
I mean, it's flabbergasting to me to think of, when I know so many people who can get a camera and shoot something digital and have a great idea, what you can do for $10 million.
Oh, yeah.
What that means.
Yeah.
And then I see, I mean, I get so depressed seeing, a spectacle in the movie theaters when I start thinking how much money did this, 2 minutes of things exploding and, spaceships flying around cost to animate in the computer, and it's about nothing. And I'd rather Tim Burton do go to Amazon if that's what it takes.
I'd love that to happen. I really would. I mean, I think, just in my head, I'm thinking Amazon in particular have really pushed the boat out, and I think the work they've done on Preacher, and the work they did on like American Gods, two shows that, they're both. I really enjoy both of them. They've got their flaws, but they've really sort of taken risks. They're not pandering to an audience. They're as you said, like, screw the audience. It's like, no, we're making this show. It's going to be nuts. It's going to be weird. And you're either along for the ride or you get off, because that's what it is. And I think that's sort of a real brave approach. And, there are people that I know that watch those shows and go, yeah, I didn't get it. I didn't like that. It was too weird for me. But then there's others that go like, no, it was brilliant, and I was fully invested in it, and I really loved it, and I think that's great. I think that's what they should be doing, and just tailoring their budgets to it a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I think about how apropos of Burton doing animation again, how Netflix got Matt Groening to do that fantasy show.
Yes.
I forget what it's called.
Disenchantment.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And, how awesome would it be to get Tim Burton to create an animated franchise, where, you can do a season of it, all of his wackiest designs, who cares, we're Netflix, go nuts. And let's see where it goes. If it gets ratings, we'll make more of them.
Yeah, I'd love that. That would be amazing. Sort of just 8 episodes, 8 or 10 half-hour episodes of him doing, whether it be pencil animation or 2D animation or stop motion animation. I prefer stop motion, I think, but just something would be amazing. That would be, like you say, let him off the leash, let him be that director, and he I think he's still in there.
Oh, I think so too, and I have faith. Burton seems to me to be somebody who, while he's gotten older, still has ideas, and still when I see him in interview, he's still quirky and has fun ideas. He might be a little jaded from directing movies in Hollywood for so many years, but I'd love to see. He seems like somebody who has endless designs. And his sketchbooks kind of demonstrate that.
Yeah, and hopefully someone at Netflix is listening to this and they'll take it on. But I think that's great. I think we'll wrap up there. I think we've gone off on numerous wonderful tangents, and that's why I love these conversations, because and that's sort of why I've started doing these thought pieces, because we can start from somewhere and go wherever. So thank you, Julian.
One thing that I love doing this, and I love what you're doing, and I just want to encourage everyone to donate to your Patreon if you've got a spare dollar. I mean, Scott is an awesome guy, and I love these conversations, and I hope that the audience does too.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's been listen to him. He's right. The Patreon is there. Please, if you want to do some more, because we've got another conversation coming up soon. And I've got some other great things coming up. I've got working with other people. We're looking at, because there's 80 years of Batman as well this year, so I'm going to be doing some Batman stuff. I'm going to be doing some other film reviews. We're going to do some retrospectives. But you and I, Julian, we're going to talk about something that I think both of us have an appreciation and both agree that it's an underrated classic, and that is Alan Moore's Miracle Man. Or Marvel Man, Miracle Man, whichever trademark you want to put to it. But Miracle Man, soon. We're going to be talking about that, aren't we?
Yes, and I can't wait. I mean, that is probably above almost any subject what I find, I can't wait to do that podcast. I find it endlessly fascinating and probably think about it far more than a selfie.
Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, well, there it was. What a fantastic conversation. I love it when Julian comes on. We always have some great conversations, and that one, as I said, went all over the place. A couple of big tangents, but I'm hoping you agree that actually it was a conversation worth having. And I know there are people that are big fans of Tim Burton, and I know there's some people that just, really don't like his style. But either way, I'm sure there's a director out there that you think is underappreciated, or whose style is underappreciated, or you think just their filmography is underappreciated. That's what we're talking about in this conversation, and I think they all need to be sort of champions. If you love a director and you love their back catalogue, you talk about it and you let people know. Okay, well, the next show, as I mentioned, that Julian's going to be a big discussion and review of the Alan Moore series, Miracle Man. But before that, we're going to get dark, and we're going to start talking Batman. It's been 80 years. It's 80 years of Batman this year. So on the next show, we're going to be talking The Dark Knight Returns, and we're going to get into a deep discussion and review of that book, where it stands today, where it stands in history, and why it's so important to Batman mythology and pop culture in general. So we'll talk about that in the next show. However, if you want to get in contact with us to talk about anything we talked about today, or any topics you think we should be talking about in the future, please get in contact with me at 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com, or at 20th Century Geek on all the social medias. That's Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, and Instagram. And of course, I will be getting on it more this year, but we will be doing Patreon, and we do have a Patreon, so please go check that out. And if you want to throw some coppers our way, it's greatly appreciated. But in the meantime, Happy New Year! Welcome to 2019, and we'll talk again soon.